Because the graphic novel Mouse is a juxtaposition of the past and the present and shows how the past is still sort of a contributing factor to the lives of the current lives of Art and Vladek. There is a sort of sense that the past is never really stuck in the past. The past is always continually influencing the present as well. So it sort of is a question that this book brings up is who is our protagonist? Whose story is this really? And I think the question is sort of twofold, right? There is the main bulk of the story, which is Vladek's narrative of how he survived through World War II and the Holocaust, and met and fell in love with Anya, and how they both struggled to survive, and how they lived while in Auschwitz, and then how they were finally reunited. So we have that story being told. We also have this glimpses of Vladek in the present, in Art's present, where he is an old man and he's now newly remarried, or he's not newly remarried, but he's remarried to Mala. And there's a lot of sort of antagonism between he and Mala. There's also tension between Art and his father. So we get a sense of Vladek as an elderly man who is still sort of struggling with some of the issues that came up during the Holocaust or were generated during this moment in his history. So he still has sort of symptoms or behaviors that go back to originate in his experience of survival, and it was a formative process, a formative experience in who he is as a man. So his personality was sort of defined and created through his experience of survival. So we do gain a sense of Vladek as one of the principal protagonists in Mouse. At the same time, this is also Art's story. So Art, even though he's the one recording Vladek's narrative, which seems to be the primary narrative of the primary testimony in which Mouse is based, we also get the story of Art and his difficulties, his process of dealing with his relationship with Vladek. So this relationship again is fraught and dysfunctional, and there's a lot of sort of tension and anger that Art holds for his father, and we see that also played out throughout the narrative. Art will also sort of deal with his own issues in relationship to his father, and how he is also, in a sense, a survivor, even though he was not born until after the Holocaust. He is also the survivor in the sense that his parents were both survivors, and their trauma also becomes his trauma. And in many ways, he's still affected. This subsequent generation of the children of Holocaust survivors are also survivors in the sense that the trauma has been passed down from one generation to the next. Parents who are again traumatized by the experience, carried a lot of that anger and victimized sense of self into, or long after the event, right, occurred, they still hold on to a lot of those feelings, and their personalities were formed during this experience. And again, how is that passed down, or how does that influence their children? It becomes evident in Art's struggle to come to terms with who his father is and his own relationship with his father. So we also get that narrative and that transformation over the course of Mouse, where Art's experience of coming to terms with being Vladek's son and his own mixed feelings that he has for his father throughout his childhood, and then as an adult, they did not have a very close relationship. So over the course of Mouse, we also see a sort of growing closeness between Art and Vladek. And I think we get a sense that Art maybe is gaining a better sense of who his father is and was, and why he is the way that he is. So I would also say that Art is another protagonist. So there's another layer of narrative where Art is the main character of the story. So we can briefly look through some of the central themes or ideas that are part of Mouse, and these are all things you might want to mention while you're analyzing the panel that you've selected for your upcoming writing assignment. But certain themes stand out for me, and we'll talk about each one of these in more detail. But I just thought we would briefly go over a couple of interesting ideas that are present in this book. So the first one is this idea of trauma and its after effects, and I've talked a little bit about this already, but the fact that if in any situation of trauma, so something that you experienced that was life-threatening or that changed your sense of self, you face some sort of experience that was brought fear and dread into your life. There's often after effects of that experience, and we see that with Vladek, and to some extent we even see that with Art, who are both, in a sense, survivors. So with Vladek, we get a sense that his personality has been formed by the Holocaust, his experience of struggling to survive, and there's a lot of sort of feelings that reoccur throughout his adult life following this sort of definitive moment in his life. So he carries a lot of guilt. He has feelings, sort of obsessive, compulsive feelings. He suffers from anxiety. You could even refer to his sort of disability as a post-traumatic stress disorder. He carries blame, and there's a sense of suffering, long-lasting suffer and survivor guilt, also in relation to Anya's death, as well as the many people loved ones whose lives were lost during the Holocaust. Another theme or idea that we get in the story is generational conflict. So we talked a bit about this already, but the fact that Art and Vladek are there's tension between them. The relationship is not one that is smooth, and there's dysfunctional sort of bond between father and son. So we do get a sense that there is a kind of generational guilt or generational trauma that passes from the parents to the children of survivors, in this case Holocaust survivors. And we get that sense that Art also is affected by the Holocaust, even though he was never even born until after. So he still experiences some sort of secondhand trauma following just the experience of growing up the child of two Holocaust survivors. The issue of memory will also be integral to understanding Mouse. So there are some issues of whether or not Vladek's testimony is completely reliable, and the fact that the book itself is sort of talking about history and how histories are often subjective memories, right? We all have memories of how things occurred, but my point of view would be different from your point of view. So each person has their own sort of selective history, and it could differ from the sort of recorded history that we read in a textbook. So history is, once again, subjective. Another huge issue in Mouse is the depiction of race, ethnicity, and genocide, and particularly how Art Spiegelman uses the animal allegory, so the cat and mouse and other subsequent animals within this sort of food chain or hierarchy of power, that he uses animals as a way to depict ethnic groups. He'll also use the allegory of masks, so certain characters will wear the mask of another animal in order to pass within that community in society. So he's sort of using these metaphors or figurative comparisons, so animals, masks, as a way to comment on the ethnic hierarchy that existed at the time of World War II. And he's also sort of commenting on some of the constructed nature of these divisions between different ethnic groups. So that'll be something we'll talk about repeatedly throughout the text. And then this issue of survival, so this is another theme or idea that is very prominent in this text. And what exactly does it take for somebody to survive? There's a measure of luck involved, right? It is completely random in some cases whether you lived or died. It could be the whim of a guard or an SS soldier walking the streets and he just decides on his own whim to take your life. So in that sense, it could all be very much random. At the same time, we have someone like Vladek who is fighting to survive, right? He is very much a resourceful, ingenious at times, quick thinking, and has sort of such a great presence of mind in order to keep himself alive and keep Anya alive as well. So survival is again about a combination of factors that go into that person's ability to live day to day. And then finally, the issue of representation. We'll talk about this idea of metafiction and how the text uses and depicts some of the struggles that Art as a writer faces trying to piece together his father's story and make sense of it, and just the struggles of putting into words and pictures something that was so unspeakably horrible. So how does he do that in a way that respects and preserves and honors the memories of his father and his mother, as well as those others who lost their lives, without trivializing their experience? And he's also doing this in comic form, right? So he's taking a traditionally undervalued form of art and then using it to represent something that is about the most sort of traumatic experience of the 20th century, right? So it is a struggle that he faces as the creator of this graphic novel. So if we start looking at book one, we can begin with the opening prologue. And this is the only scene that we get of Art as a child. So we get a little bit of insight into how he grew up and his sort of dysfunctional relationship with Vladek is apparent in this opening prologue, where Art is playing with his friends. He trips and he falls, hurts himself, and then comes to Vladek for sympathy, crying and sniffling. And then he's sort of asking his father, he's telling his father, I fell and my friends skated away without me. So he wants his father's sort of comfort. And his father is there working, so he's always, the depiction of Vladek as being sort of continually at work, always industrious. And then Art's playing with his friends, so there's sort of a contrast there. And then instead of comforting his son, Vladek answers, friends, your friends, if you lock them together in a room with no food for a week, then you could see what it is, friends. So as Art sort of is talking about this moment, this sort of just passing moment when he hurts himself while playing with his friends, Vladek is bringing up his Holocaust experience and what it was really like to struggle to survive, and again, identifying something that will become sort of an ongoing theme within his life, which is the fact that he can't really have trust for anybody, including his so-called friends and family even. So it's sort of an indication of what's to come, a bit of a foreshadow into the fact that for Vladek, his life has largely been determined by without trusting anybody. He could only trust himself and live for sort of protect he and Anya, and other people would, again, so-called friends would end up betraying them. So we have an indication of that immediately within our prologue, and we also see some of the tension that occurs between father and son, and how Vladek's character, the defining moment in his life is the Holocaust, and he continually will bring this up throughout Art's life, and it also becomes a sort of frame of reference in Art's own experience of himself and his childhood, that he is also sort of traumatized by being the son of two Holocaust survivors.